Hey everyone, welcome to the Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm sitting down with the VP and CHRO of a company that you may have heard of. It's a small little company called Chevron, and Rhonda Morris has been leading their HR team after spending the majority of her career building the HR function within Chevron. And so I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about the inner workings of HR in a enterprise, global, long-standing business like Chevron. So Rhonda, thanks so much for coming on. I'd love to have you open with an introduction for the guests.
Well, Lars, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to spend some time chatting with you. And I believe your question is just say a little bit about myself. Well, I'll start with our company's headquartered in Northern California. I am a native Northern Californian. The house I grew up in is about 25 miles from where I'm sitting today in San Ramon. I have been with Chevron for 30 years, and that's one of the least favorite questions I get asked because it makes me feel kind of old. But I've had an amazing time here. I met my husband at the company. I have a 19-year-old daughter, and I think the Bay Area is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And even though I've moved probably 7 or 8 times in the course of my life for work and other reasons, I always have this sort of magnetic pull back to Oakland, California, where I live.
Yeah. Well, look, I think Chevron as a business probably needs a little introduction for the audience, right? You've used Chevron, and pardon me, I'm battling a little bit of a cold right now, so forgive the cough. You've been a consumer of Chevron. You've seen the company. It's an iconic brand. But I imagine most people don't know the inner workings, obviously, of the business and the HR team. So I'd love for you to give an overview of, can you describe the footprint of the business in terms of, locations, employees, and then an overview of your HR team to support them?
Sure, happy to do that. Our company is 143 years old. So yes, we've been around for quite some time. We operate in 55 countries. We have about 40,000 employees, and our business streams, I'll try to make it simple. We have upstream, midstream, and downstream. Most people, when they think about Chevron, think about what's called our downstream business. That's our manufacturing, our retail service stations, our marketing, et cetera. But the biggest part of our business is actually our exploration and production business all around the world. And that's what's called upstream. And we're what's referred to as an integrated oil company. There are some oil companies that are just upstream, some that are just midstream. And what our midstream business does is we explore for oil, we ship it to our refinery. So our midstream business is our shipping company, our pipeline company. So we're transporting it from where we found it to one of our refinery facilities or our production facility. And it's we have about roughly 1,000 HR people supporting those 3 businesses. Those 3 businesses were consolidated last year into one organization called Oil Products and Gas, but there are embedded HR people who support those 3 businesses, but we also have several centers of expertise that support the enterprise. That would be compensation and benefits, known by some as total remuneration, our learning and talent group, and even our HR shared service centers in Buenos Aires and Manila support the enterprise. So we've got a model where we have business HR people who are dedicated to supporting the business, and then we have centers of expertise who focus on work that supports the entire enterprise. And that's allowed us to standardize a number of processes over the last couple of years. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it's not lacking complexity from the sound of it. So I imagine it is a full job that is definitely holding your attention. When you kind of coming up from within Chevron, were there particular functional areas within the HR team that you came up through? Like, what was just walk us through kind of your background and path, to the CHRO role?
So I have in some respects, a pretty non-traditional path as a Chevron employee, period, and even as a Chevron HR professional, because I was not recruited off of campus. I went on a literally letter writing campaign to get hired when I graduated from business school at Boston University, because Chevron didn't recruit there. And when I graduated from business school, I wanted to really I wanted to work for Chevron. I've known about the company for a long time. My grandfather actually worked for Exxon, um, and he cleaned tanks in the late 40s and 50s. And my father thought getting a job at Chevron was one of the best things that you could do. So I was very fortunate. My marketing campaign worked. I was hired into the HR development program back in 1991, and I worked for the company. In our development program, you rotate assignments every 6 months for 2 years. And so the intent is to expose people on the program to different parts of the business. And I spent 3 of my 4 assignments in the same business, our downstream business. And when I finished the program, I was very open that I would work pretty much anywhere, but I wanted some experiences outside of our downstream business. And I love our downstream business. I spent most of my career there. And I ended up in a labor relations role in our downstream business at one of our refineries. And 5 years into my career, I made a decision to leave the company. So I'm a boomeranger. And I left the energy industry and spent 3 years working for Haagen-Dazs ice cream. So I made a pretty sharp industry pivot. And I learned a lot from leaving a company like Chevron, going to work for what was then the Pillsbury company. And I never thought I would come back to Chevron, but I ended up coming back. And the reason I left Pillsbury is I was traveling 80% of the time. It wasn't, I had one of the best bosses I'd ever had, but I really didn't have a personal life because I was on the road for such a long time. I then, when I made the decision and I learned from working at Pillsbury, something I try to use in my role today, and that's the importance of how you treat people when they leave a company. And Pillsbury was incredibly gracious with people who were leaving. You could have open conversations about the simple fact that either a location wasn't working for you or your partner. The excessive traveling was really wearing on you, and they would work with individuals to see if there was a way and an opportunity for the person to stay. And if you didn't, they were very gracious about your departure, recognizing, this was one of my key learnings, everybody's a consumer.
Yeah.
And everybody is a consumer. And I have never said one bad thing about my experiences working at Pillsbury. I had a couple of job offers when I was making that decision, and I never lost contact with people in Chevron. And one of them said, you should come back. And I said, well, people don't really do that. And that's a little odd. And when I left, I wasn't really part of the plan. But to make a long story short, I did come back. And I spent a number of years in HR manager. Well, I came back to a corporate HR assignment, which was kind of what I was looking for when I left. But I was only in that role for 9 months before I went back to an HR manager role in our marketing business, which was part of downstream. And I just came to the conclusion, this is where I'm supposed to be, and I should just come to peace with it. So lo and behold, I ended up from the marketing job, and I've always thought about, I like working here because I feel like I can fill gray space. I'm one of those people who likes to fill gray space, and I've always worked on any leadership team I've been on, anything that would help support the objectives of the organization, whether it was HR related or not. And that's kind of what led to my leaving the HR function for 7 years and working in Europe as first the marketing director for our European downstream business, then as the general manager of our fuels business, and then as the vice president of our European fuels business before we sold the business to Valero in oh gosh, probably about 11 years or so again. And then I ended up coming back to HR to be the HR VP for our downstream business. And that's a job I had before I got this one. But that is a really long answer to your question. So I spent a little bit of my career in the corporation. I spent the majority of it in our downstream business. But because of this complex relationship that you referenced between our centers of expertise and our business, I actually understood how it worked. And spending that much time in a P&L role and a marketing role has really helped me, I think, do this job differently. And I hope it's helped me do it better.
Yeah. And let's talk about that for a minute, because I think when you look at the changing nature of the CHRO or the CPO role, particularly as they're navigating just this complexity of today's world, today's market, today's talent pool. I mean, so many layers you can look at it, but this is, the role has never been more complex. The role has never been more challenging. And I think that you find the influx of people, moving into or out of and then into this seat from other areas of the business is a real differentiator. So I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit, because there may be people watching who, feel that they need to follow a linear career path,
Right.
the CHRO seat, but that's actually not necessarily, I mean, yes, you could still do that, but there's other ways that actually may be more advantageous to move into the business and back into the role. And so if you could maybe just, expand on that a little bit from your perspective.
Well, I'm a huge advocate of moving outside of the HR function, because I think there was nothing better for me than to be a customer I wasn't a customer of HR when
Yeah.
the 7 years I was gone. So what it built for me is a kind of laser sharp focus on perspective. And the perspective isn't on what you want to share with someone. It's on how it will be received by them. And even from the standpoint of how you communicate, how you engage. And I really try to emphasize and kind of push my direct reports to engage with business leaders, not at the end, but as you are developing something. Just ask opinions. It matters. It builds advocacy. It helps you execute faster. I also was the recipient of HR cost allocations. So it's helped me focus on how we are actually managing the operating expense of our function, because we're not a profit center, we're a cost center.
Yeah. And so when you think about that, like obviously what you're navigating and designing and kind of architecting the people strategy across, as you mentioned, I think over 50 countries, 40,000 employees, multiple lines of business, multiple centers of excellence.
Right.
How do you think about like how you design and prioritize and adapt your kind of HR people talent strategy across such a complex environment?
We refreshed our people strategy in 2022, and we spent probably about a year and a half looking at internal and external trends that are going to impact our company and that are going to impact our industry. And relative to half of our employees are in the United States, but half of them are in 54 countries outside of the United States. We expect leaders, as they progress through the organization, to go to larger roles. We have an expectation that they spend at least one assignment outside of their home country, and that's to build perspective and engagement of how we can actually execute across the 55 countries. And sometimes we have to pace things so they will go live. And like when we did our Workday deployment, we did a 4-year Workday deployment in 2 years. One of the things we decided to do was not start in the US. It would be easy. It's half the workforce. We actually started in we did 5 countries in Asia. That decision was not made by me. It was made, the recommendation came from, I will never forget this. I was having lunch in our cafeteria with our head of upstream, and I was talking through with him the deployment process and how we should do this. And he said, well, why don't we start with a complex country that has multiple currencies? So we started, even though it was small, it was incredibly complex. So, and it actually helped us learn as we continued deploying Workday around the rest of our enterprise. So there's engagement with the business. And that's an example of something that I found really helpful and actually helped us accelerate that particular deployment faster. To get back to your question about the people strategy and trends, 3 areas that were informed by the trends were, one is rapidly changing technology, and I think everybody is very familiar with that. The second one is the focus on flexibility that employees are asking for. And it's not just hybrid working, it's flexibility with it could be, compensation and benefits and how they're paid, or a cafeteria menu of options. And then the third one is the changing expectations of employees towards employers. And so that led us to 4 focus areas of our people strategy. One is our employment model. We still have a long-term employment model. I've been here 30 years. I am not alone with having that much service. One of my best friends in the company recently retired with 40 years of service. And so we've had this model. It's worked for us. The Great Resignation didn't actually happen at Chevron. Our attrition percentage for 2022 was 4.5%. And we actually disaggregate that. And if you want me to talk about that a little in more detail a little later, I'm happy to do it. But one is our employment model and continuing to refresh how we're doing what we're doing with from a pay and benefits standpoint. The second one is skill building and continuing to provide resources to upskill our employees so they can help us deliver our enterprise strategy. The third one focus area is leadership. We want to build great, diverse leaders. And then the fourth focus area is culture.
Yeah. I'd love to expand on the skills piece for a moment, because I think, sure, that's obviously one of the big kind of meta trends, I think, in the world of work right now. And certainly the HR people function is how do we begin shifting from role-based to skill-based? And that applies to recruiting, it applies to talent development, talent mobility, retention, obviously. Do you have any programs that you've launched to help you, kind of map and identify skills within your employees and then figure out what skills may be transferable to other roles where it may open opportunities for internal talent that based on a resume, somebody may not necessarily make that connection?
Well, I'll start by saying I believe, and I learned this from someone I worked for years ago, smart people can do a lot of things. And we're a company where even before this focus on skills was happening, similar to myself, working in HR, leaving HR, coming back to HR, we've moved people around different functions for quite some time. So this focus on skills is helping to augment that. One of the technology shifts we made, we had, I believe, about 88 different learning and development platforms before we deployed Workday.
Yeah.
We now have one platform and it's like a curated Netflix type experience. It's called iLearn, and iLearn, it's a Chevron term for the platform that we're using. And we launched this during the pandemic, but we didn't do it with a kind of big bang. Here's kind of the shiny new toy. We used the people who were managing these other disparate platforms to put their content, continue building continue building the content that was in this platform, and employees are using it. The growth has been really organic. And I've looked at the statistics of usage pretty frequently, and it is absolutely shocking in a good way of what people are actually doing on their own without a program, without required training. And we can look at the top 5 areas of skills that people are what's the right way to describe this? They're learning on their own. They're taking the initiative to do that. And it's sort of agile tech methodology, business acumen. There are different types of languages. And what I find fascinating, some of these things, I don't even know what they are. And I thought, how do we how do we keep up with this? But I've been really pleased with the thirst for learning and self-development that our workforce has. And I feel really good that we've created an avenue for them to do that, whether it's taking an online class, whether it's watching a video, whether it's reading a book. It's just, it's been pretty successful.
I'd love to get a sense, you kind of mentioned, kind of soft launching that in the early days of the pandemic. One of the things you launched in the pandemic, excuse me, is a TV platform with the studio and so much more. Like, I want to learn about this because I think, internal comms, however you frame that, but I think importantly, obviously, there's been so many events that the world has been through, right? Not just HR or business, but the world has been through since the pandemic, including the pandemic. And our ability to communicate, especially as we move to remote and hybrid constructs, has never been more important. And you had a very unique approach to that. So tell me more about that.
So your question is about my internal TV show called Business Casual. Is that correct?
You got it. Yes.
Okay. It was launched towards the end of the pandemic when we could bring people back together in offices. So I'll tell you kind of the journey we got to finding a different way to engage with our workforce during the pandemic. And I am incredibly proud of this. We communicated with our employees so frequently. Our CEO was getting feedback that we were communicating too much. And this was largely through his entire leadership team having asked me anything, virtual town halls, and our head of health and medical and our head of safety continuing to provide updates on the pandemic. But what happened is it was the same format. It was on video, was using a chat function for people to ask questions. And people got a little bit fatigued with that.
Yeah.
But because they got fatigued with that, didn't mean we should stop engaging with them. And so my communications advisor and I were talking about, well, what can we do that's different? And we came up with this idea of having an internal television show that has a studio audience of employees, and it has guests who are employees, and things that it's not live, it's taped, but topics we've covered. The very first one we did, Lars, was about mental health and well-being.
Yeah.
And we had employees tell their own stories of challenges that they've had, but they also talked about how they manage them. And so it wasn't just, these are the things that I'm struggling with. It was, these are the things I'm struggling with. And these are some actions I've taken to try to work on either myself or work to get better. And what I learned from that was the power of employees hearing from each other, not just from leaders.
Yeah. And that's amazing. So this was like, a full-on studio.
Yes, it is a full-on studio.
Is this still happening?
Yes, it's still happening. We actually had some help from CNBC, our set design. We'd never done this before. It was actually backwards. And so I have a good friend at CNBC named Jen Geller, and she kind of said, you guys need to turn. It was we showed her kind of the structured layout, and she said, it's backwards and your back's to the audience. You just need to move some things around. So we got a little bit of help from CNBC.
That's a pretty good help. Yeah, that's not bad guidance to get
Yes,
from they may have a bit of experience there.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I've had some requests to film a segment outside of the US. So it's going to be filmed in Singapore in July. And that gets back to kind of a question you asked about managing a global organization. We don't do everything. We don't want to do everything out of the United States. It's kind of a heavy lift and a big production to move it there, but half our workforce is outside the United States. So it's important for us to do that.
Yeah. And I want to talk about another, habit, ritual thing that you have that I think is a very unique way to engage employees. And that is a letter writing campaign. And when you first told me about this, I thought it was just so unique and so interesting, and just not something that you often see executives open up to their employees. So tell me more about how that came to be. Just give me more kind of context and details on the program.
So throughout the pandemic, we have an internal social media platform called Workplace. It's basically Facebook at work. And during the pandemic on Sundays, and I still do it a little bit periodically, I would just write. I send out a ton of communications to employees, but a lot of it is about kind of the normal things you would expect the head of HR to communicate to the workforce. But as the pandemic was starting back in March of 2020, I just decided to start writing about what was happening with me. I had a daughter in high school who was remote learning. I had my mother 10 miles away who was sheltered in place in her house, and I wouldn't let her go outside even before California put the shelter in place mandates in. And so I started to write about things I was dealing with that I knew everybody else was dealing with. And I didn't do it every Sunday, but so that set up a way for me to engage and connect with the workforce about kind of the weirdness we were all collectively going through. And I would, my mother was coping with COVID other COVID restrictions by gardening. And then I, write something and I post pictures of her roses. And what's happened, Lars, is my mother has this fan club in the company. And if I travel, people ask me, how's your mom doing? How come you stopped posting pictures of roses? So that let me kind of open up more to the workforce. I in January of this year, I wrote a post and I explained why I stopped doing that. I said, I stopped because people were saying, well, how come you stopped writing on Sundays? I said, well, because it reminds me of the pandemic and I don't want to take us back to that kind of dark time. And I said, I will continue writing, but I will do more, but not as frequently as I would. But I said, I will tell you this year, I have an idea. My husband told me it was a really bad idea, but I think I'm right and he's wrong. And I said, if you write to me this year, hand write a letter to me, I will write you back. And I want to know three things. One, how you're doing. Two, what are you excited about? And three, what are you doing to recharge? And this whole process brings me a ton of joy because people have forgotten what it's like to see someone's handwriting. Every single person who's written to me has answered all of my questions. Some of them have written about the fact that they haven't written a letter in so long they forget that it was frustrating that you can't correct what you've written.
Yeah. Where's the delete button?
There's no delete button. One employee wrote to me in pencil so that she could erase. And I feel like I'm getting much richer feedback than I would get from an employee survey. And we do employee surveys too, but it's been very rewarding.
Yeah. One more question I'd love to get your perspective on, and then I want to kind of jump into the lightning round to help the audience get to know you a little bit more. Obviously you are in a role as the CHRO of Chevron where, it's a very complex environment. It's a complex organization. You've kind of walked us through your career path on how you got to that role. What advice do you have for aspiring CHROs, CPOs, heads of people, whatever the title might be, but somebody who is kind of in that upward trajectory in their own career and they seek a role similar to yours? What's something that you've learned, could be the hard way, could be the easy way, that you'd want to pass on that wisdom down to them?
So I would say two things. So number one, and I mentioned this, I think earlier, perspective really matters, and not your perspective, but thinking about things from the perspective of your customer, and customer being the people that the HR function really supports. Actually, I'm going to say three things. Number two would be communication. I think there should be much more emphasis on effective communication and effective, simple communication, because the more complicated, I think my job is to take away roadblocks that prevent people from doing their job well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we really need to, an area we really need to focus on. And the third one is I will pass on some advice. The person who had my job when I joined the company shared with a group of us when we had lunch with him. His name was Lou Fernandez. He said, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how great your idea is. If you cannot successfully engage, communicate, and bring along the people who need to execute your idea or your project, you will never be successful. And I never forgot that.
Yeah, that's really good advice.
It was great. I mean, it's true.
It's so true. And again, I think that, the ability, again, kind of gets back to the complexity of the role standpoint, right? It's like HR acumen isn't enough. Like HR acumen plus business acumen isn't enough. Like you also have to have that communication piece and that ability to influence and earn trust and communicate visually, written, multimedia these days. I mean, it's just, there's so much to it. So, Ron, I really enjoyed learning more about your role, your career, what you're building at Chevron. And we close every episode with a lightning round to help the audience get to know you a bit better on a personal level. And we always start with music. Okay. So what was your first concert?
Jackson 5 at the Circle Star Theater in San Mateo, California.
Wow. That may be, there's been some great ones. I don't know if you can top that. That may, you may have moved into the pole position, but Jackson 5, that's impressive. Okay, next we've got streaming on TV. So what was the latest show that you binge watched or streamed and recommend?
So I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but you can help me figure out what it is. I actually stopped watching it because it was giving me a headache. It's on Apple TV, and it's about the group of people who are working in a place where you're in the office and you only remember things in the office, and then when you leave the office, you only remember things in your personal life. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember what it's called, but I've seen the
Yes.
previews for it. It did look interesting. But now you've given me a bit of a disclaimer. I have a pause now. Maybe I'll hold off on that one.
Okay. No, it's not. It's really good, but it messes with your mind, but it's like, wow, this is pretty incredible.
Yeah. And Rhonda, last question for you. What is bringing you joy lately?
So I mentioned the letter writing is bringing me joy. I also do a series with Adam Bryant on LinkedIn, the Leading in the B-Suite series, where we interview Black executives about life, their life stories, their leadership lessons, and we have conversations about constructive conversations about race. And we've been doing this since 2020 after George Floyd was murdered, and it really generated. I'd met Adam a couple of years ago when he interviewed me for a different series that he does. But being able to help people see role models of Black leaders, learn from them what their life experiences have been like, and also kind of keep pushing on. We have to have some conversations that for a lot of people are awkward and difficult. And we're just trying to continue to show we can actually do this.
Well, I appreciate you sharing. I appreciate that work to begin with, but I also appreciate you sharing that with us. I'll include a link to that show in the show notes of this episode. So if you're watching this, definitely encourage you to check that out as well. So Rhonda, it's been a real pleasure. I appreciate you making time to share your work, take us inside your studio. I mean, that's pretty cool. And yeah, thanks so much for making time to help us understand a bit more about your work and how Chevron is set up.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Lars.